Good evening and welcome to the first round of the SENIORA competition. Tonight, the debate is that we as the Australian government would never give aid to repressive regimes. The affirmative team is Alex, Sierra, Georgia with Sierra on reply. The negative team is Inika, Emily, Lara with Inika giving a reply. I now call upon Alex to open this team's list.
This is a very simple debate tonight. One thing, the Australian government has many reasons to prioritise supporting democratic regimes. They want as many democratic regimes that look after their people as possible, because what that means is you have other people to work with you have people to trade with, and you do not have to deal with these regressive regimes. The only way to do that is when a regressive regime is struggling, you let that regime die. You trade off the small amount of suffering that may be experienced for an actual future for that regime, instead of supporting it with aid that will get misused, that will get misallocated, and will continually be used to harm those people into the future. A couple of things in setup before we get onto our team's case. Generally, we just think that if the Australian government supports any repressive regimes in the status quo, they simply stop and they won't start reporting any regimes into the future. What we think a regressive regime looks like, repressive regime looks like, is something like North Korea to Zimbabwe. Generally, you're restricting your people's capacity, to speak. You're basically censoring everyone, or you are actively going out of your way to put people in education camps. No, thank you, or to attack your citizens. We think you probably only need aid if you are struggling greatly within these regimes. What Australia wants, we think what Australia wants is they want to be able to trade with people, they want to have democracy, and they want to have a good international image generally. 2 points in substantive. Firstly, why this I'll take you in a second. Firstly, why this is necessarily an implicit endorsement of those regimes, and why that is contradictory for Australia. And secondly, why this strengthens the regimes into the future. Yes.
When a repressive regime crumbles, do you not acknowledge there's no guarantee that a better system will come into place?
Yeah, okay. Look, two things here. One, yes, there may not be a guarantee, but necessarily we think there is the likelihood of, when you are fighting against that type of regime, it is likely that there are other people fighting it probably want you not to be starving, and that's the general priority of the people for some amount of peace to come about. We think the most logical way for this is through democracy. We as Australia are happy to help facilitate that. But beyond that, the fact of the matter is, because something is awful now and it could be awful in the future, that is not a reason never to try to achieve something better. We always want to prioritize seeking a better future for ourselves. No, thank you. Now onto this first point of why it's necessarily an implicit endorsement. So let's just quickly look at what Australia wants. On the international stage, Australia wants to look necessarily good. It wants to look like it cares about democracy, because that is what it necessarily cares about. It wants to necessarily work with other nations that have similar beliefs, because that is what is easiest to work with. You cannot we use the example of North Korea. You cannot work with North Korea because you have such different beliefs. North Korea legitimately destroys aid it receives from countries like Australia, from the United States, because it sees that they are so different, it cannot even accept that aid, because that is implicitly agreeing with them. And finally, I just want to mention that all trade necessarily is contingent, with these nations, is necessarily contingent upon being similar to some extent. You are always going to prioritize trade with other nations which are similar to you, and would actually support you if you went into political turmoil. That is to say that Australia probably isn't going to go out and deploy troops with these deploy troops to help these nations. If there's some type of people, I'll take you in a second, trying to overthrow it, necessarily that means Australia isn't going to trade with them. They're probably going to trade with some other repressive regime. Yes.
Why should individual citizens who just happen to live in these countries suffer because their government makes actions that the Australian government doesn't think is good?
Okay, so why should they suffer? Necessarily we think they are suffering in the status quo, and this is a question of whether or not Australia should necessarily intervene. The suffering is already occurring. So this is going to come up later, but it is a question over whether or not you want to like continue that suffering. And note that suffering is going to continue under opposition's house regardless, but on our side of the house, we have this like simple fact that we might actually achieve something better. The simple fact that we actually have a like better high-end outcome within this debate simply means that we win overall, because opposition can never actually provide an example where it is a good outcome for these citizens. Okay, so what happens when we actually support these countries and provide them aid? It can be seen to like be implicitly like supporting them. This like comes about in two ways. One, the fact that you are actually like supplying them aid says that they are the legitimate government of that nation. That means that the citizens view them as the legitimate government of the nation, and you like decrease the like rate at which people are probably going to challenge it. Because if they think like a democratic like a nation like Australia is supporting it, one, it is impossible to overthrow them, but two, like their government probably isn't as bad, and we kind of just have to deal with it. But secondly, we think that like at the point where you work with them, you lose the capacity to call them out, because if you call them out on all of these human rights violations, you're simply not going to accept your aid anymore. So you are literally like shackled by the fact that you have to provide the aid. What is the like harm of this necessarily? Firstly, like it's straight up just like, and this is the main harm, you completely contradict Australia's ideals. No, thank you. Like what this means is that Australia necessarily wants like democratic nations which share its ideals with it. We've explained why like necessarily this is important for trade and things. But at the point where you do this, you are having to concede those ideals. And we think being like ethically inconsistent is incredibly harmful, because at that point there isn't any like no thank you. There isn't any limitation what you can actually do, and your people like actually end up lacking faith in you, because there is no like reason why you should be consistent with your own people. No thank you. We think that like this just generally destroys that. Finally, within this, we think there is necessarily like a mandate to like do good, like to like other nations when you can, and try to like help them achieve the best outcome. This is going to get into the second point, but this is to say that we want to prioritize the best outcome, not some mediocre outcome which is going to continue in the future and continue paying. No, thank you. Okay, on to the second point of why we like strengthen the regime. 2 points within this. One, that we like necessarily increase the like regime's capacity to oppress their own people, but secondly, that we perpetuate it into the future and it becomes like incredibly difficult to overthrow. Firstly, why necessarily like this is going to be used against their own people? Note at the point where you are like providing things like food, like money towards this regime, all of that stuff is necessarily going to go towards the military, because they're going to prioritize helping the military in that. This means that like at the point where there is a famine, no thank you, within the nation, by giving money to the military, you simply just make it easier for them to fight against freedom fighters. But beyond this, we think that like you could like giving like money to the regime or giving food or like textbooks or something that simply just allows them to reallocate funds towards their military, no thank you, from other areas which they had to do. They are only ever going to give their citizens the bare minimum requirements, and because of that, what that means is that it's always going to be just diverted into other ways. So at the point where you like increase the net amount of money, gross amount of money within the nation, you just increase the like amount of money which can be diverted into other ways to like oppress those people. But secondly, at the point like beyond this, you are simply just like increasing the rate for the regime to like perpetuate itself. We think that if you like even in the best case scenario for opposition, and the food does go towards the people, right? It's what's going to end up happening is at the point where they become like dependent upon food from the government, like the regime is just never going to stop. You are going to have this oppressive regime there for the rest of time, and the people are like never going to get to the point where they're going to say, yes, we have to fight it. We have no other option. Because of that, like. And yes, while they may be while they may experience some amount of pain under our side of the house, having to go through like a civil war, the fact of the matter is you will never get anything better under opposition, and because of that, they lose this debate. If you cannot reach out for something that is better than the repressive, oppressive regime, then you should not then you should not provide aid so something better can actually come about. So proud to propose.
Thank you, Alex. I now call upon Iniko to open the team space.
I think it was bizarre for the opposition to characterise Australia's priorities and Australia's morals as improving democracy in other countries. I think that is a mischaracterisation of what we as a country are trying to do, and I think that it is better to say that our country's main incentive here should be to make sure that the least amount of people suffer and that the least amount of people die. It wasn't enough for Alex to say that this was a trade-off for these regimes supposedly like coming down really, really quickly as soon as we stopped giving them aid, because that simply wasn't true. They had to trade off some amount of people dying for virtually no benefits, and the point at which they were willing to do that, they weren't upholding morals in the way that they positioned themselves in their principled argument. I'm going to talk about 2 issues of rebuttal and then have 2 substantive points. So firstly, on rebuttal. Firstly, like, does the Australian government have an incentive to not give people aid so that we don't morally endorse all of these regimes? And secondly, what is the outcome to the people in those regimes? So firstly, how does this endorse those countries? Firstly, I just don't think it's true that the regime is being financially supported to the extent that they said. I think that you can give food to individuals in a country without simultaneously helping them do genocide to their ethnic minorities. I think those 2 things can be completely separate. We don't just have to give them a nice big check with a whole bunch of money and then immediately turn around and shut our eyes and pretend to not see what they're doing with it. I think we can specifically give them food and medicine and resources that cannot be manipulated in a negative way. That is something that wasn't addressed at all by the opposition. Not all of these things go straight towards the government helping to do horrible things to their citizens. But secondly, I think that to some extent, it is not true to say that we're endorsing a certain country's all of their political beliefs just by giving them aid. For example, this is obviously a different example where we do trade with countries like America, and we pretty clearly are able to like absolve ourselves of responsibility of some of the things that they do. I think that these 2 things can be separate a lot of the time. I think that if we thought that interacting with the country at all and giving them any aid was somehow also making ourselves guilty for all the crimes that they had committed, then we would not have a lot of countries to interact with, because a lot of countries have some kind of past or some kind of awful thing that they've done, even if they're not super oppressive regimes in the way that like some of these countries are. So I think to that extent, it also possibly like the moral of just being like, we're not going to interact with these people at all, doesn't particularly help anyone in that country. And I think it's more important to prioritize the outcomes to the individuals in that country rather than stopping aid to a certain country simply for like looks and so that we can look morally consistent to other countries. I also don't think it's true that this puts us in a better position to call out those regimes. I think another example of this is just that you're more likely to listen to a country that you feel like that you're allied with, and not a country that you feel like has been withholding aid for you. I think it's more true then that you were able to call out these countries to a greater extent, at which point you were already giving them aid, which I will address further in my substantive points. Okay, so the second argument about the outcomes to people in that country was quite short, and most of what they talked about was specifically supporting the military. Firstly, I think that soldiers are also people and should get food, and even though they are obviously doing bad things by being a part of the military in this country, it is also true that they've been forced into that situation, I'll take you in a second, because of the country that they live in, and therefore they are still sympathetic and deserve food and medicine. Yeah.
How can we show that we disapprove of a regime if we continue to feed and fund them?
I think there are a lot of ways. I think we can do diplomacy with them. I think we can just sort of take a stance against them, or even like some types of sanctions that don't actually affect the people in that country. An example of this is like sanctioning South Africa by not letting them participate in the Olympics while simultaneously not having like trade sanctions with them. So those kinds of things that disapprove of the country as a whole without negatively affecting the individual citizens who just so happen to live in that country. Okay, so then we just heard that like the only outcome if you give them aid is a civil war. I just don't think this is true. I think I will elaborate more in my substantive as to why giving them aid allows you to better overcome that oppressive regime, and definitely doesn't lead to a civil war. I'm not really sure where that came from. Okay, on to my 2 points in this speech. The first on the government's obligation and imperative to protect people and to look after individuals, and secondly, why it's better for the country and for the people in that country. Okay, so the Australian government likes to protect individuals and likes to provide for individuals, and I think that is our primary obligation. I think to an extent we care about democracy, but I think more important than that is making sure that individuals are safe and healthy and stuff like that. Yeah, and it is good to be consistent and to be like morally accountable for those things. Yeah, so in that sense, if we can prove that we are the team that helps more individuals, that is obviously the course of action that the Australian government should take, given our number one priority is protecting those individuals, and not stuff like making sure every single country is a democracy always. But I will also address why we achieve that better by taking down that regime, by like allying ourselves with them. Yeah, so I'm going to move on to that substantive point, and I think a lot of the principle like follows through in here, in the practical point. Yes, okay. So firstly, so Alex told us that the people in this country would never actually see these resources. Here's why that's not true. The government has an incentive to keep the people in their country alive, to the extent that if you were a dictator, you want people to dictate over, you want to have a country that you can be in control of, and to that extent, you want to give these people these resources. Maybe it's not the entire amount, but it is still some amount that is better than them just entirely starving to death, which is what we've seen happen when the government has refused to give aid to repressive regimes. I'll take in a second, in places like Iran prior to the invasion. Yeah.
If those people are required to rule over the dictator, why would they not just give them the resources when we're not providing aid, and they simply have less money to throw around into other things like in the military, or to fund their private palace and extravagant dinners?
Well, I'm not sure I really understand that. They would still be giving them some money, I think is the point, and the point also is that these countries are often also quite poor and wouldn't have the money to do that either way, which is why the aid is important. Okay, let's speed through this. Yeah, so misinformation is the primary tool that these dictators use to control their citizens. So they don't necessarily have an incentive to starve all of their citizens to death. Okay, so why do we take down dictatorships on our side of the house? Democracy can't exist without certain types of infrastructure, that's like healthcare and education, which are needed. Otherwise, as soon as some kind of civil war happens, as Alex pointed out, there is simply a power vacuum, and we end up with this situation like Syria, where everything is sort of just falling apart. It is much better if we can increase the wealth in this country, increase the infrastructure in this country, and then because that country now trusts us, we can trade with them and do some kind of negotiation and diplomacy that allows for a fair democracy to be established in that country. That country also has an incentive to listen because we have given them aid previously. Yes, so with that in mind, you just end up with much better infrastructure in those countries so that they can transition into democracy. And for those reasons, we achieve the goals of both instilling democracy in these countries without actually actively hurting, and instead helping the individuals who live in those countries, which is clearly what the Australian government should be striving to do. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Nika. I now call upon Sierra to continue the team's case.
I'm not sure what type of foreign dictator would let you freeze their foreign bank accounts and simultaneously allow you to distribute aid to their citizens in that country. I think that the tension that existed in the affirmative case, negative case in this debate, was the fact that you could not simultaneously implement things like sanctions and other forms of hard diplomatic policy whilst also distributing aid within that country. Because you needed to get those leaders on side, you needed to become friendly with those despots, and that was always going to be in tension with any legitimate aims of democratizing that country. That was why we were the side that got all of the benefits of actually uplifting those people. Two things in this speech. Firstly, why you won't distribute that aid in a way that was actually not going to embolden those despots. But secondly, you've got more xenophobic immigration policy and attitudes within Australia. But before that, two questions in rebuttal. Firstly, is this morally something that Australia as an actor should support? And secondly, the outcomes in terms of democratising and getting a better quality of life for these citizens. On that first point about whether or not Australia as an actor should morally support this, we know that Australia posits to be some kind of democratic bastion in the world. We think that they want to uphold human rights. We think they want to, not be seen to be complicit in the egregious human rights violations that occur, things like genocide, like ethnic cleansing, like burning down villages, and like doing violent and assault on these people. Why is that really important? Firstly, it's to say that you necessarily need to recognise the legitimacy of these governments. You need to say, yes, you're a legitimate person who I'm going to send this aid and money to. But secondly, you needed to make concessions, meaning you couldn't simultaneously sanction them because then they would take all of the millions and millions of dollars you spent on that aid and burn it in a fire. That was a huge leverage they had over you under their side of the house. But thirdly, they give us this point which is like, well, if you just never gave aid to people you politically disagreed with, we'd never get anywhere. I think there's a difference between like subtle little nuances in politics between different countries versus an actual genocidal dictator who is ethnically cleansing citizens in that country. That is a hard line that we are clear to like stick by under our side. Next on the question of outcomes in this debate. So they want to bring up sanctions as something they can still do. We tell you no, you cannot still do sanctions because you need the government and that entire infrastructure to support you distributing that aid. But secondly, they tell us you can just be an ally with this country. The reason first why you can't ally yourself with like a genocidal dictator is because you needed to preserve your standing on the world stage, particularly when you're a country like Australia who wanted to be friendly with the other democracies and not like just like essentially go on the fringes of being like known with like all those other countries who were really bad and despicable. You could not simultaneously just go and say, I'm going to be an ally of yours and now we're going to cooperate. And that was oftentimes because these weren't just like issues that could be conceded upon, right? These were things like, I want to ethnically cleanse this particular religious group, and if you don't let me do that, I'm just going to burn this aid in a fire. That was not something you could just go back and forth with. That was something you had to topple aggressively, and the only way you did that was by not emboldening those regimes. Next, what do they tell us? They tell us you need to have like healthcare and things like that to have democracy in a way that was natural. Why was that just not going to happen under their side? First of all of your priority was to go and put that money into the military as an autocratic regime. Why was that the case? Firstly, because if you were a dictator and you did not do that, there was a huge likelihood you would die in some particular way, meaning you had a huge personal incentive to do that. But secondly, because you couldn't trade with other countries, you couldn't necessarily like make your economy great. So the only way in which you could maintain your power on the global stage was to necessarily embolden your military, because that was the only thing still accessible to you. But the last thing to say here is that even if you do get these countries to get great infrastructure, boost their economy, you don't topple the regime, you simply give credence to the notion that not illiberal democracies and repressive regimes are good systems of economic management, and we should actually just preference that, right? You don't topple a regime by giving it money and giving it power and by like making it look really good on the world stage. The exact opposite occurs under their side of the house. Moving into substantive. 2 points here. First on why you won't distribute this aid in a way that actually goes to people, and second on why you get worse policy for migrants and refugees. On that first point about distributing aid, firstly we tell you that they want to say they're going to prioritise things like food and giving medical resources, but even to the extent that we think that these countries would require you to give a certain amount of money, because that would be just like a part of the negotiation you'd have to concede upon, we're still going to talk about what would happen if it was primarily food. We tell you that because firstly, the governments owned every single infrastructure in that country that distributed foods, I'll take you in a second, the judiciary, the police, the military, they had no incentive to actually give those to the people who they hated most, like the ethnic minorities, but instead were likely going to redirect that to their militaries. I'll take you now.
Repressive militaristic regimes can pose a serious security risk to Australia through terrorism and conflict. Why should Australia not attempt to secure itself against such threats by building a relationship with these states?
I don't think that that's going to be the factor at which they decide they're not going to go and bomb you, right? I think that that's like something that they're likely to do anyway because you're probably just a good target. And oftentimes when those things occur, they're like lone wolf actors who happen to come out of those countries, not necessarily the entire government going and wanting to start like a war and like World War III with another country. But even if that was the case, we think that Australia as a country should not shake on its morals simply to be protected when it knows that it has the military capacity to protect itself and its citizens. If you want to posit that Australia wants to care about people, you should care about the religious minorities who are still going to be starved under your side of the house and abused with more guns and more violence because you've emboldened that military. That is what we think this debate is actually about. Secondly, the reason why they won't actually give it out to people is because they want to appear to be self-sustaining, right? The narrative of isolationism, that we're going to be a great country and be despotic at the same time, relies on you not having aid packages come in with logos from like the UN or another country, because that goes against the power that you, as that regime, actually have. Thirdly, because you lose your leverage to negotiate with these countries, I already alluded to this, but at the point at which you now like have trading embargoes on you, no thank you, you're not going to say, okay, yeah, I'll pop the trading embargo, but like let me make it really easy for you to give all this food to like the ethnic minorities I hate in these villages that you know nothing about. That's not going to happen. You never get the food to those people, right? The last thing to say here is on the question of food and healthcare. Who is this going to go to? Firstly, we tell you at first, it's likely to go to the military, but even if it doesn't go to the military, it's going to the people who are like slightly food insecure, but the government still doesn't hate you enough to like burn your villages down and push you into other countries. Those were not the people who were actually being oppressed in the majority of those circumstances. They were just the people who, like, yeah, by virtue of being a country that didn't care about its economy, was still going to be tangibly poor, but still weren't being targeted by the government. You never actually got the most impact under your side because you never helped the people who were the most harmed by that particular regime. Why is this really bad? Firstly, because you empower these regimes without actually lifting up the people who you claim to help. That is so problematic considering the fact that you will just keep on having them exist in perpetuity, never actually ending when you keep on giving them money to survive. And I'll take you in a second. That is so harmful for all the people you claim to care about, sure.
On our side, we don't have to choose to continue to give aid to countries that are not reforming their behaviour in any way. Whereas under your side, you have to choose to never engage with those countries through aid at all. How do you respond to that?
I think the first thing to say is we don't have to never engage with them. Like, we don't just like say you don't exist, right? So all of our interactions with them are geared towards condemning you and telling you that like killing people in your own country is not an okay thing to do. That means we can implement things like sanctions without having to worry about our like aid packages being destroyed. But the second thing to say there is that you do to an extent have to support them forever because you never have any transparency to see where this food is actually going. And that's what you never actually address in your case as like a mechanism, right? Which is that yes, it is true that they can say we are giving this food to the ethnic minorities or people who are starving, but you don't have a good and robust media system. You don't have integrity of like the institutions, the courts or anything, so you don't actually ever know that. Into the 2.2 quickly. At the point at which you now have Australian politicians who want to be populist and bigoted saying our money is going to being like to supporting ridiculous things like human rights violations, it is much easier to promote narratives that say we should not be giving any foreign aid whatsoever, and more importantly, it stigmatizes the people who arrive on our shores as refugees as being a part of these evil regimes. At the point at which you say that, at the point at which you make it clear that this is the type of regime you want to support as Australia, you should not concede. You should instead empower these people by not giving support to those governments who hate them. We should stand with the side of London. So proud to oppose.
Thank you, Sierra. I now call upon the second speaker, the negative team, Emily, to further their team's answer.
Ladies and gentlemen, there are many ways to give aid. Aid is not just about giving guns to everyone, handing vaccines straight to the government, or dropping food from the sky, or necessarily conceding everything to a government that you're working with. In some circumstances, those measures will be appropriate. However, aid can look like many different things. Aid from the Australian government could look like helping a particular NGO in that country. It could look like asking for conditional measures, so asking that the country engage in some kind of democratic reform to give them access to materials that they desperately need, or to give them access to the kind of medical supplies that they want in their country. We may not give aid to all repressive regimes under our side of the house. However, we are the side of the house that defends the fact that it is in the Australian government's best interest to engage in certain instances of giving aid to repressive regimes. And just because we can't help every single person in that country necessarily, in every single case, doesn't mean that we should engage with that. Because we are the team that stand up for individuals and think that it is worth going in, that it is consistent with the Australian government's goals, that we do go in and try and defend individuals' lives and try and defend Australia's strategic objectives, and don't choose to wash our hands of the situation in the international community simply because of the actions of a repressive government. No, thank you. 2 points in this speech. Firstly, why it's in Australia's most strategic interest to give aid to repressive regimes, and secondly, why it's better for the economy. But before I get onto that, 2 issues on rebuttal. So firstly, about how the aid will be implemented and whether this will be successful, and secondly, about impacts to xenophobia. So onto the first issue now, about how aid will be implemented. So we got told by the affirmative team that the aid will be poorly implemented because the government owns infrastructure and has no incentive to actually give the aid to people who need it the most. So first, a few responses to that. So firstly, we think that a lot of repressive regimes don't all look the same. It's not like every single repressive regime doesn't want to give food to everyone or anything like that. We think that in some cases that they're not engaging with like all cases in the scenario. But importantly, we think that often it's an issue of like a scarcity of food and about how to prioritize distributing it. So it's not necessarily that they want every single person to starve, but we acknowledge that in cases where there is perhaps a prioritization of certain classes of civilians, you're more likely to get that. We think that in our case, we then have more food to go around, so it's more likely than under their side to go to the people who need it the most. But also we think that often, no thank you, these countries might have difficulties, they've been embargoed by other nations, or they have a scarcity of certain resources. where they're happy to try and combat an issue, but they need access to resources. So I think that, for instance, the COVID-19 pandemic is a really classic example, a great example of this, because they might have a shortage of medical supplies, and that's somewhere where they could use that to help the whole community, and that's in everyone's best interest. The Australian government would stand by doing that, no thank you, even if it's a repressive regime. Secondly, we just say, if it's unsuccessful, if the country is not engaging in some kind of no thank you, giving us whatever our strategic objective might be in that case, which might not only be actually giving the aid, it might be an Australian strategic objective, we think that it's perfectly fine that we'll stop giving aid to that country. We're happy to adjust our approach, but we're willing to try in the first place. They told us that people getting the aid will not be the people who are most repressed. They told us that they might just be other poor people in that nation. We on the negative team here are perfectly happy people living in poverty to be lifted out of poverty and to have aid from the Australian government to do so. Even if we can't help every single person in that nation, doesn't mean that people deserve to be languishing in poverty when Australia has the resources and it's in their best interest to assist these people, and that's why we think that we should give aid to repressive regimes. Secondly, onto the issue of xenophobia and racism. So the affirmative team told us that this will help. Yes, please.
Why should we not just simply give the aid to other nations which don't have repressive regimes, where we can also lift people out of poverty and probably will be allocated a lot better?
So a few responses to that. So firstly, we note that a lot of nations that are in our region in the Pacific do have quite repressive governments. So this is countries like Thailand that do have repressive governments, but are really important strategically for Australia's interests, as I'll establish later. But yeah, secondly, we think that it's not a case of necessarily that we're trying to lift every single person out of poverty, but there are important strategic objectives the government's trying to achieve. And sometimes that will involve giving aid to countries where there is no repressive government, and sometimes that will involve giving aid to countries where there is a repressive government. I mean, we should judge that based on what's in Australia's best interest, not just on the particular government that they have. So back to this point about xenophobia. So we got told that this would send a message to Australians that all of their aid is going to nations that engage in human rights violations and decrease people's willingness to support foreign aid. How we think, firstly, that this will not occur because people will understand that this is actually about trying to support particular nations to engage in change and growth. I mean that it will not necessarily be like a huge portion of the budget, and that often people are just like largely ill-informed about foreign aid in the first place, and we can target the foreign aid in a way that means that we're not directly endorsing it. This is not about giving guns to dangerous military regimes. This is about giving out targeting our aid such that it is consistent with Australia's objectives, and we don't think that will actually result in a decrease in people's buy-in. The other material that we had was that it stigmatises people who come from these regions. I think firstly, most people your average Australian is not making like a deeply complicated algorithm about where that person came from and whether the Australian government gives them aid. But we think more importantly, by saying that country is condemned and refusing to engage with that country at all, and they're so bad we can't give aid to them, that is what actually validates people's racist attitudes in the first place. And finally, if the Australian government has a terrible relationship with that other country, such that they're not supporting them in any way, we don't understand how people were able to leave that country to come from Australia. We think the best way to actually support people seeking refuge in Australia is to build a workable relationship in the first place through the provision of aid. So now 2 points of substantive. Firstly about security outcomes, and secondly about the economy. So to the first point about Australian security. So we think in a world, I'll take a POI now if you happen to have one.
How can you benefit from getting, an Australian COVID-19 vaccination if you've already been gassed or put in a re-education camp?
Yeah, we think that if you've been horribly subject to genocide, you probably aren't going to benefit from the COVID-19 vaccination because unfortunately it is too late for those people. We think that's not like all cases, and that's like really disingenuous engagement with the debate. And we think that of course we want to support bringing down the regime, but when people are still alive and they're suffering right now in front of us, I think the Australian government is in their best interest to help them. So now the point about Australian security. So in a world where we don't engage with foreign aid, we don't have any avenue for relationship with that, and that can undermine Australian security in some really crucial ways. And so firstly, we think that foreign aid is crucial for military stabilising the region. I think that often, like if there is military instability or that kind of thing in Australia's region, that can result in really negative outcomes for Australian security. We think there are two so that might look like, for instance, if you're worried about religious fundamentalism contributing to terrorism on Australian shores, you might do things like try and fund secular schools in that community to try and combat that messaging. Secondly, you might try and just quell the problems due to aid. So if you're worried about people engaging in military coups and things like that because of the circumstances, I think that giving aid can be a helpful way to combat that. Secondly, as my first speaker alluded to, the narrative of isolation can really fuel a lot of these regimes by giving aid and showing these countries that they are not alone, people in these nations, that they are cared for. That combats that narrative of isolation. Thirdly, we as COVID-19 has demonstrated, there are global health emergencies that do affect all of us. So things like having COVID-19 in Thailand, having people travelling around the world is a security threat for Australia. So we think that regardless whether that nation is a repressive regime or not, it is in Australia's best interest to support them. Fourthly, we think that Australia uniquely needs to build strategic partnerships due to its isolation. It's really important that they do build these security partnerships so that by giving aid, they can build those relationships, even if it's with a repressive regime, such that if there's an Australian citizen stuck over abroad, they're able to actually have a relationship to facilitate the rescue of them. And fifth, and finally, we can increase the status of Australia as a regional leader, which overall increases security and flows into important economic outcomes I'll talk about in a second. And importantly, it's consistent with the Australian government's objectives in the case of repressive regimes. Secondly, briefly about Australia's economy, we think that aid creates a mutually beneficial partnership. This might be things like access to key waterways for shipping vessels, or improving Australia's status in the community so they get more trade, improving exports to regimes, or access to resources. These are all things that we can achieve when trading through repressive regimes, and that's why we're so proud to oppose.
Thank you, Emily. I now call upon Georgia to conclude her team's case.
We have an opposition tonight that is willing to turn a blind eye to repressive regimes. Their only solution that they were able to offer us was presented by Inika as that they would do diplomacy and that would somehow fix these systems by maybe, I don't know, banning them from the Olympics as their solution. We think that for the Australian government to do this would be harmful on multiple levels. First of all, because it allows the repression to continue and implicitly supports it. Secondly, it makes the system harder to break down. Then it continues to oppress the citizens, that is who we all agree that we wanted to help in this debate. And finally, it also poses some risks to us as Australia of having a repressive regime as one of our neighbours, just as the negative team has outlined. So, three main issues in tonight's debate. First of all, what is Australia's role in a system that has a repressive regime? Secondly, what actually changes the regime? And finally, what is the better for the citizens of that regime? So, onto this first one of what is Australia's role? The negative team tonight has portrayed Australia's role as being like some sort of superhero, just a second, who descends from like the heavens to give money to the poor and lift them out of poverty. Yeah.
How do you propose that the Australian governments are meant to manipulate aid from Australia if they come through the format of like helping NGOs or like sending in people to do work?
We're completely against Australia providing any sort of aid to these regimes, and we think that that is what's actually going to have an effect. That's going to be the impetus for people, for the system to change as a whole. Under your system, where you continue either to go around different routes or all you're doing is just, oh, we're banning them from the Olympics, that's where these systems can continue to exist. This is exactly the problem I was talking about in your team's case, where you think that just giving this money is somehow going to fix the problems. This, first of all, fails to recognise that often aid money doesn't go to those that need it most, as Alex outlined at the first speaker. Second of all, then it needs to be acknowledged that this is like you're simultaneously turning a blind eye to the repression by continuing to support these countries, or in some cases, even worse, you are making the situation worse. You're allowing this repression to continue and supporting it. What's important to this is that this should not be Australia's role at all. It's key to acknowledge that as the affirmative team, we're not against foreign aid as a whole, but we are against giving it to countries that have repressive regimes in whatever form whatsoever. We think that our role when we come to having repressive regimes is first of all to keep our people safe and spend our taxes well. We think that when these regimes continue to exist, they're likely to put us more in danger, as you've already pointed out as the negative team. But we also think that it's damaging for our system that we continue to use Australian aid money to fund these regimes that are putting us at risk. Next, we have to do what's best for the citizens of these countries. As I'm going to explain later, these are the people that need our protection most, and we can best do this by facilitating them breaking down the system rather than building up a system. No, telling them that they should break it down themselves. And finally, our key role overall as Australians is to oppose and stop these regimes, not to turn a blind eye. On to my second issue. What actually changes the regime? So we have two different options here tonight. The negative team has told us that they're going to do nothing. They're going to try and engage with these systems by simultaneously breaking it up, and they haven't given us any analysis on how the city is going to break down the system other than banning the Olympics might upset them. Yes, actually.
Under your team, the only hope to try and promote political change is to hope that people starve long and hard enough that they're willing to risk having a violent civil war, they might lose all of their families so they can overthrow the government. Are you really seriously happy to just starve people enough that they're willing to change, as opposed to giving them aid in the meantime?
We think that what we need to do is come for a system that is going to help these people faster. And we think that maybe we do have to make the trade-off of cutting some aid, and we recognise that there are risks to the citizens of that, but we think that those risks are nowhere near as bad as allowing the repressive regime to continue. It doesn't matter if you've got food from the Australians, schools from the Australians, whatever, if your government is gassing you or putting you in re-education camps. That's why we think it's better to do something faster and actually try and solve the problem rather than supporting the system. So under the negative team, we're sending the message that we are willing to back down. We're going to allow it to continue to happen and ignore what the government's doing. This ignores what's happened and continues to fund the act and allows the government to spend the money we're giving them to oppress the people. The money doesn't go, as my team's already explained, the money doesn't actually go to those that need it most. Inika told us that maybe how we can show that we disapprove is like the fact that we show that we disapprove of America while still being one of their allies. I think this is a key example of where it is unclear when Australia disapproves of something because they continue to support it. It is very unclear if America disagrees with something that Australia has said because we're always funding. We're willing to go into war with them even when they're in the wrong just because we want to be behind them. On our side, however, we are communicating to other countries that we are willing, to the country and to other countries, that we don't support what they're doing. We're reducing the income to these countries so that they have less money to spend on their repressive regimes, and we're making it more likely that people are going to rise up. We're going to facilitate having a change of government, having something happen, rather than allowing the system to continue. It's important to acknowledge that whilst the negative team has painted this great picture of it being us that are going to starve these people out, what actually happens under their system is no better. Because in most cases, a repressive regime that is spending all their time, destroying a community group isn't simultaneously going to be giving them Australian food. They're trying to repress these people. They're not going out there to also help them with the nice sacks of rice we're sending over.
You have either one of two options. One, the government just suddenly decides to give up all of their power and stop being an oppressive regime because they're not getting money for Australia. Or two, the people congregate and create a civil war. Which is it, and how are those things going to happen?
We think the thing that is much better under our side of the case is that something is going to happen, and that all your logic is based on the fact that the money we're sending over there actually ever gets through to the people. We're not willing to make that assumption because it generally doesn't happen. So on to my final point of my final issue, what is better for the people? So under the negative team side of the house, we're still giving aid to these countries. We're continuing to support them. But as I've already said, the people that we care about most, those people that are being repressed, are unable to enjoy this because either they've already been gassed or they're in a re-education camp, or the government hates them enough that they're not going to distribute this to them. This leaves the repression free to go on because it is Australia that continues funding the fancy lifestyles of the government officials and allows people to starve on the streets. Nothing changes, and we see this as being a lot worse than getting no food or aid. Under the affirmative team, however, we're willing to make the trade-off of not giving them the aid that they probably weren't getting anyway. We see that this actually makes an impetus for change.
situation actually is in this country. Therefore, it has the ability for things to move on and improve. As Australians, we have a duty to do what actually helps the citizens by fixing the system. For these reasons, we are so proud to propose.
Thank you, Georgia. And I call up Lara to conclude their team case.
For a team that really wanted to talk about how not giving aid to these countries was going to be a large impetus for change, it was actually fascinating that all of their examples of countries which were repressive at first speaker were countries which currently weren't given aid by Australia. We think that in and of itself proves that not giving aid to these countries didn't give them a single incentive to change their ways, and they were probably able to keep doing all of the things that they were doing. Whereas on our side, we actually changed how these countries were currently functioning and gave them the incentive and the ability to change their ways. That was so important in this debate. 3 issues. Firstly, on whether it was more important for Australia to prioritise not endorsing regimes or protecting civilians. Secondly, on the impacts to people within those countries and how regimes would change. And thirdly, on the actual interests of Australia that we tell you about at segment. Let's start with this first issue on whether Australia prioritised endorsing regimes or protecting civilians. The opposition tell us from first that it's wrong to endorse repressive regimes because this means that you're implicitly supporting them. They tell us the first reason of this is because you legitimize that these are real countries and real governments. We think firstly the fact that you're giving people aid probably actually just sends the message that they're lacking and they need help, not that they are somehow strong regimes that you would support. But secondly, we thought the idea that you have to legitimize governments to the people living in those countries is bizarre, because those people probably saw every day all of the horrible things that were happening to them, and they didn't need Australian government sending in aid to realise that their government was oppressive or that it was doing things to them. We thought the impact Australia had on legitimising or not legitimising these countries was actually relatively small. But moreover, they constantly throughout this debate give us this idea that we're going to lose our capacity to be able to call out these countries. We didn't think that was true, and it's kind of antithetical to the idea of aid, right? Because if you're giving these people resources or you're giving things that are going to help people who are oppressed by their governments, that's a pretty clear identifier that the things that they are doing are wrong and that you disagree with them. But moreover, we tell you that these people are probably able to have different levels of critique. So you can give them resources in one way, but you could probably still in other channels say what they were doing was wrong. And we gave you historical examples of where that's happened. It's also interesting to note, no thank you, that the opposition thinks that you have to be close to despots to be able to do this. We thought again no, because we can still condemn them. The final thing they tell us here is that the reason it's important for Australia to be able to carry these things out is because something about it's wrong to be ethically inconsistent. But we thought what was probably more important was nuance and being able to decide in what situations things were more valuable rather than just sticking to the same thing all the time. The opposition's ignorance towards nuance was also shown in their characterization, where they don't give us a variety of examples of regimes which could have different incentives. And that's important when we consider the fact that Australia cares about life, right? Because we think it's not just that they care about democracies, they also cared about vulnerable people and how to help them. When the opposition tell us it's a trade-off that they're willing to make, that some people are going to literally starve to death in order to have change, we thought this was never a trade-off that they should have been willing to make. Because it was not certain under their side that these regimes were going to improve, as we gave you the examples of places like Zimbabwe still being able to function, but it was certain under their side that people were going to die. We thought because of that, our principle was stronger, not only on the question of certainty, that we were certainly going to help people, whereas they only had the vague chance that maybe this regime would eventuate into a democratic system that was strong, but also because we tell you that regimes could potentially change under either side, but you can't just bring these people back to life. We thought that because we were able to protect people's interests more, that was always a large benefit on our side.
Wait.
Sure.
Is your model really reliant on governments who kill their own people, recognising the sanctity of an NGO and not just taking that aid for themselves?
Okay, this is something I'll respond to in the second issue, but I'm just going to jump into it now since you prompted it. We think there are many reasons we give you throughout our case as to why these regimes do have incentives to give aid
were ignored for some reason. So we think that we tell you a few things. Firstly, that they needed people to like rule over. They weren't just gonna let everyone die. In instances such as like the COVID-19 pandemic, it's likely they were going to give them vaccinations because if they all died, they legitimately have no source of power anymore. But secondly, we thought it was also like, they didn't want a full revolt. They wanted these people to have something. We also thought you had things such as like repercussions from the countries who were giving aid because they were powerful countries with more resources. They could probably just enact like strong sanctions or a lack of aid if it was found out these countries weren't sending them to the right places. But moreover, again, we bring up this idea of like, there are varying degrees of repressive nations. Some it's simply that you can't speak out against the government and they're not like willfully starving everyone. So if they had less resources, they would go and send them to the right places. Their response here is largely that like, oh, we won't actually know if they're sending the aid to the right places. We think that we could probably figure it out because the same way we know like which ethnic groups are currently being marginalized, we could probably monitor it and see if that continued to occur. All right, what else did they say in the second issue on furthering regimes? They tell us that these regimes are simply going to use the funding for their own benefit, namely through channeling it through the military. But firstly, we say that we don't have to send certain things. We don't have to send weaponry. And like if you like drop in books, they're not going to start like using those as weapons, and they're not going to be able to reallocate funds in the way the opposition tell us to, because like who are they going to use to convert that money? So finally, at the end of this like idea about whether these people are going to get aid or not, the opposition say, well, even if they got the aid, they're going to be dependent on food from the government, and that's going to mean they don't revolt. But we think that like history says no, that's not true. Like people with food can still revolt, and they're probably going to be more successful, which leads to the final thing I want to say in this issue, which is just that I'll take you in a second. Democracy needs building blocks to succeed, as we tell you, and we can guarantee this under our side when we give them aid, rather than just like the opposition's alternative, which is power vacuums. Yes.
You literally just conceded that if the people get food, they are then able to revolt. Is this not the strongest incentive for the government never to give the people food within your own case?
No, we don't think so, because we don't think that the governments necessarily think about that. Their main calculus is whether they were going to continue to have power, which is not going to happen when these people legitimately die. So they are going to give them food, they are going to give them healthcare, and that's going to be a benefit. But like even if we take that regardless of whether those repressive regimes wanted to give people aid, as I already told you, there were mechanisms separate from those repressive regimes, such as things like government accountability and like holding those people liable for the fact that they didn't give aid. Okay, just briefly, I want to talk about like the narratives about helping countries on either side. This was largely responded to, but we think people tend to be compassionate, and because of aid, saying like this is a signal that these people deserve help, they weren't going to be as horrible to these people as the opposition thought. On the third issue of like what was actually better for Australia, note that this was material that we gave you at second that largely went unresponded to about how Australia was going to be benefited in terms of security and the economy. In a debate about Australian interests, it was very important that the opposition didn't respond to this because it meant it all still stood at the end of the debate, that we were going to be able to have stronger relationships for Australia, stabilise the region around them, and ensure that we could have trade in a way that was beneficial to us as a whole. Because we were the team that actually was able to change these regimes and give them an impetus to change, we were so proud to oppose.
Thank you, Lara, and I call upon Inika to give the team's reply.
The opposition's case fell apart when they failed to point out a mechanism between suddenly not giving all of these countries aid and apparently that leading to those regimes falling apart and that leading to all of those countries suddenly being really, really good to their citizens. What they failed to do in this debate was explain exactly how or why that would occur when we gave you heaps of material under our side of the house as why giving aid to these countries puts Australia in a better position to negotiate that those countries stop doing the oppressive things that they do. I'm going to discuss three things in this reply. Firstly, on what is Australia's obligation and what are our morals and our goals. Secondly, on who helps most people. And thirdly, but related to helping people who actually overcomes these dictatorships. So firstly, on Australia's morals and goals. The affirmative team prioritised democracy and putting democracy in these countries over the short-term well-being of the people in those countries, which was important because we told you from first that Australia's primary goal was to help the human rights of people and to help the well-being of people, rather than projecting some kind of external projection as a country that is good, and that was our primary goal, rather than being like morally inconsistent or being perceived in a certain way. We told you that our number one goal was helping people, which was important. I will now probably just move on to the second point about why we actually help those people, but it was crucial that they misinterpreted the goals of like what Australia is doing. So in terms of who helps the most people, the affirmative team conceded that they wouldn't actually be able to help anyone in the short term, which was important because we told you at first and at second that a bunch of our benefits would occur in the short term, and to the extent that we were giving people food in these countries in the short term, which was the most important thing. They had to prove that they could take down these dictatorships because they didn't get any of those short-term benefits. And the only way that they rebutted our benefits about giving food to the people in these countries was saying just over and over again that the funds won't go to the right place and won't go to the right people. We told you all down the bench that that just wasn't true because there were heaps of different types of aid and heaps of different types of ways that you could help people in those countries, and that funding things like NGOs wasn't actually going to tangibly give the government more means through which that they could oppress people, and that even if the government was going to stop us getting aid to some like ethnic minorities and stuff like that, it was still better that we help the majority of people. That's what we told you at second, and that went unresponded to, and we just simply heard the assertion that it wouldn't go to the right people. So lastly, how do we actually overcome these dictatorships under our side of the house? And I think this is where the affirmative team's case mainly fell apart, and this was because their only mechanism for overcoming these dictatorships seemed to be for just waiting for them to fall apart or waiting for them to devolve into some kind of civil war. We heard a whole bunch of really vague mechanisms at Georgia that sounded like maybe they would be declaring war on these countries, but were super unclear and therefore unable to be substantiated in this debate. What we tell you very, very clearly from first is that we achieved diplomacy, we achieved negotiating with these countries, and we achieved building a relationship with these countries so that we have a mechanism through which we can stop them from doing certain things. We also told you that it was important to focus on establishing things like healthcare and establishing things like just good infrastructure so that they had building blocks for democracy, because even at the point at which the opposition would be able to prove that they could get some kind of overthrow of those dictatorships, we told you we still end up with better outcomes because we have those building blocks and we don't end up with a power vacuum. We brought that up at both first and third and went unresponded to. So I think that lack of a mechanism means that the opposition's case falls apart at the point at which they can't actually overthrow these dictatorships. Whether or not we overthrow those dictatorships, we still get better benefits in the short term by just helping these individuals, as well as in the long term when we can negotiate an end to those repressive regimes. And that's why we win this debate.
Dominica and Apple and Sierra to close the debate.
In no world does opposition win this debate, because either it was true that giving aid to these regimes imbued them with legitimacy and made them look strong, in which case they just existed forever, or it was the case that giving aid to these regimes made their people weak, or giving aid to these regimes made those people weak and made them able to actually launch a coup against that government and topple them. In which case, the very smart dictators who've been able to run that country for decades are likely never going to sign up. In neither case do you ever stop the crimes against humanity that occur, the genocides, the ethnic cleansing, the burning down of villages. In each and every case of the side of opposition, those egregious things continue to exist, and that is why you should side with side affirmative. Two questions in this reply. First, on the moral obligation of Australia, and second, on the outcomes in terms of increasing the welfare for these people. On the first question, we tell you from first very strongly that you have an active obligation as Australia, as a country that posits to be a democracy, to care about human rights, not to be complicit in the egregious human rights violations. Those weren't just things like abject poverty, those were things like actively going in to make the lives of people hell who you did not like for arbitrary reasons like their religion. Those were things you had to stand by, because first of all, we told you in this debate, it was likely that food was not going to actually reach those people, but secondly, if there was some doubt about how that food or that aid would actually be used, we always had to assume that in some case scenario, that was going to be used by a military to oppress the very people you claim claim to care about. You had to be okay with that. And insofar as their case whittled down in this debate to a concession to say that we would give aid to countries that had democratized, that sounded very similar to the current normative stance on giving aid to countries that were already democracies. They had to stand behind giving it to egregious places. Next on the question of whether or not Australia had an obligation to do this or whether it should prioritise things like its trade policy. If you thought it wasn't okay, if they thought it wasn't okay for us to prioritise the long-term interests of people in those countries, it was unclear for us to why trade deficits for Australian economic policy were going to be a relevant consideration in this debate. Obviously not. We cared about people who were dying and languishing in pain. On the second question in this reply, firstly on outcomes. So the first question that we need to ask here is where was this aid actually going to go and what was it going to look like? Our side was the only side that engaged in a nuanced understanding of this, right? Because firstly we told you these regimes were going to demand some money. They weren't going to take all of it in food because that was practically useless to them unless they could give it to their military, and so you were going to have to make those concessions. That meant that A, they still had some capacity to buy arms, they still had some capacity to militarize even further. But the second thing we told you was that all of their mitigatory modelling about giving it to NGOs or dropping it from the sky was all just a way to bypass the structural analysis we gave you in this debate. That was to say, when you own the courts, when you own the military and the police, you knew how to distribute that aid, you knew all of the relevant infrastructure, and you knew how to take that and give it to your own people. At the end of that characterization, it was probably true in this debate that maybe some aid would go to some people and a lot of aid would go to the government infrastructure that was oppressive and genocidal and had guns and you probably weren't going to stand up to them. It was unclear to me how the dying attempt at reviving this, which was NGOs, was actually going to save them, insofar as these were governments who actively killed people that probably didn't care about your NGOs that much. On the question of how this actually manifests in terms of toppling a democracy, they tell us we have to make the really crude trade-off between saying a certain amount of people have to die before we get toppling of a democracy. Firstly, note, that was not what we were trading off in this debate. A similar, if not more, amount of people under your side were still going to die because we told you that the people who were dying the most were the ethnic minorities who they never gave aid to. But secondly, it was important to note that what actually changed in this debate wasn't just whether or not people had food, it was whether or not these governments had the capacity to militarize even further, to make it impossible for you to ever challenge them, to militarize further, to go and stand at election boxes and say, if you don't vote for us, you're going to get a bullet in the head. That was the type of comparative difference we were talking about in this debate. You never engage with what happens when you give them aid to feed their militaries, to make them even stronger. But the second reason why legitimization was impactful in this debate was because you normalized the notion that you could engage with them in the global stage. That meant that other countries, which were less powerful than Australia, now felt comfortable selling their arms to these countries, now felt comfortable engaging in trade deals. When you emboldened repressive regimes, you were always going to allow them to exist forever. At the end of this debate, note two things. Firstly, note that a very limited, if at all any amount of aid was going to the people who both sides agreed should be cared about in this debate. But note secondly, we have mechanisms like sanctions, like freezing the accounts of people who were egregious, that were actually going to work, and which they conceded would probably work too. We should not be supporting egregious regimes, and that was what Side Affirmative told you throughout this debate, and that was why we